The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Davidson County Historical Archive in Nashville, Tennessee, casting long shadows across the rows of storage cabinets that held thousands of photographs, documents, and artifacts from the region's past. Dr. Michael Torres adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the glass case containing a recently donated collection of Civil War-era photographs. At 43, he had spent nearly 2 decades studying the social history of Reconstruction-era Appalachia, but something about this particular photograph had captured his attention in a way few artifacts ever did. The image showed a modest cabin somewhere in the Cumberland Mountains, probably taken in late 1868 based on the notation on the back. A prosperous-looking family stood on the porch, the father in a suit that had seen better days, the mother in a dark dress with a white collar, 3 children ranging from perhaps 5 to 12 years old. And standing slightly apart, near the corner post of the porch, was a young woman, maybe 20 years old, wearing a simple work dress and apron. The photograph's original caption, written in faded ink, identified her simply as Mary, household servant. Michael had seen hundreds of similar photographs from this period. The years immediately following the Civil War were a time of tremendous social upheaval and reorganization. The old plantation economy had collapsed, and new labor arrangements were emerging across the South. Many formerly enslaved people had left the region entirely, seeking opportunities in northern cities or in the western territories. Others had stayed, working as paid servants, sharecroppers, or establishing their own small farms. The photographic record of this transition was fragmentary and often complicated, showing a society struggling to redefine itself after the trauma of war. But there was something about Mary that made Michael pause. He pulled out his magnifying glass, examining her face more closely. She was looking directly at the camera, her expression serious but not hostile, her posture upright and dignified. And there, just visible above the collar of her dress, was a distinctive mark on the left side of her neck. Even in the faded sepia tones of the old photograph, the mark was clearly visible, a birthmark or possibly a scar, shaped somewhat like a crescent moon. Michael took several photographs with his high-resolution camera, making sure to capture the detail of the mark. Something about it nagged at his historian's instinct, the sense that there was a story here beyond the surface narrative. He made a note to follow up with the donor who had provided the photograph, a woman named Patricia Reynolds who had inherited a box of family papers and photographs from her grandmother's estate. The next morning, Michael called Patricia Reynolds, reaching her at her home in Knoxville. She was in her 70s, her voice warm and interested when he explained his call. Yes, she remembered the photograph. It had been among dozens of images in her grandmother's attic, most of them unlabeled or only vaguely identified. The cabin shown in the photograph had belonged to her great-great-grandfather, Jonah Reynolds, who had operated a small timber business in the mountains after the war. "Do you know anything about the young woman in the photograph?" Michael asked. "The one identified as Mary?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Not really," Patricia finally said. "My grandmother mentioned once that there had been a household servant who worked for the family for several years after the war, but she didn't know much about her. The family never talked about that period very much. I think there was some kind of falling out or disagreement, but the details were lost." Michael thanked her and promised to share any findings from his research. After hanging up, he sat at his desk, thinking about the mark on Mary's neck and why it seemed so significant. He pulled up his database of historical records from the region, beginning the painstaking process of searching for any references to a young woman named Mary who might have worked in the Cumberland Mountain area in the late 1860s. The research was slow and often frustrating. Record-keeping in the immediate post-war period had been sporadic at best. County courthouses had burned, documents had been lost or destroyed, and many people, particularly those who had been enslaved, had moved frequently, making it difficult to track their movements. But Michael was patient and methodical, working through census records, church registers, Freedmen's Bureau documents, and local newspaper archives. 3 days into his research, he found something interesting. A notation in the records of the Cumberland Gap Methodist Church, dated March 1869, referenced a Mary Colson, household worker, distinguished by the mark of heaven upon her neck. The phrase, "mark of heaven," was unusual enough to catch his attention. It suggested that the mark was distinctive, memorable, something that people in the community used to identify her. Michael dug deeper into records related to Mary Colson, finding scattered references over the next several months. She had been baptized at the Methodist Church in April 1869. She had purchased fabric at a local general store in June 1869, the purchase noted in the store's account book. She had been mentioned in a letter written by a local schoolteacher in August 1869, praising her determination to learn to read despite having received no formal education as a child. But then the trail went cold. After September 1869, there were no more references to Mary Colson in the local records. She seemed to have disappeared from the Cumberland Gap area entirely. Michael found this puzzling and somewhat troubling. Had she moved on to another community? Had she married and changed her name? Or had something happened to her? He expanded his search, looking through records from neighboring counties, from cities like Knoxville and Chattanooga where many rural workers had migrated in search of better opportunities. He spent hours scrolling through digitized newspaper archives, looking for any mention of a Mary Colson or a young woman with a distinctive birthmark on her neck. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Rebecca Lawson, a colleague who specialized in women's history in the post-war South, stopped by his office one afternoon with a book she thought he might find interesting. It was a collection of oral histories gathered in the 1930s as part of a Works Progress Administration project. Interviews with elderly residents of East Tennessee about their memories of the Civil War and Reconstruction periods. Michael thanked her and set the book aside, planning to look at it later. But that evening, unable to sleep and still thinking about the mysterious Mary Colson, he pulled out the book and began reading. Most of the interviews covered familiar ground, stories of hardship during the war, of Federal and Confederate troops moving through the mountains, of the difficult years that followed as communities tried to rebuild. Then, about halfway through the book, he found an interview with a woman named Sarah Whitfield, conducted in 1937 when she was 92 years old. Sarah had grown up in the Cumberland Mountain region and had vivid memories of the post-war period. Near the end of her interview, she mentioned something that made Michael sit up straight in his chair. There was a girl worked for the Reynolds family, Sarah had told the interviewer. Pretty thing with a mark on her neck shaped like a moon. Folks said she'd been stolen as a baby during the war and her real family was looking for her. But nobody knew where she'd come from originally, and she didn't remember nothing about her early years. It was quite the mystery at the time. Michael read the passage 3 times, his mind racing. Stolen as a baby during the war. A family looking for her. This changed everything. What he had assumed was a straightforward story of a household servant was actually something much more complex. A story of displacement and lost identity, of a young woman who didn't know her own origins. He immediately began a new line of research, looking for records of missing children during the Civil War period. The war had created enormous chaos, particularly in the border regions where Appalachia sat uneasily between Union and Confederate territory. Families had been separated, children had been orphaned or displaced, and the disruption of normal social structures had made it easy for people to lose track of one another. In the archives of the Tennessee State Library, Michael found a collection of advertisements that had been placed in newspapers during and after the war by families searching for missing relatives. There were dozens of them, heartbreaking notices from parents looking for children who had disappeared during the conflict, from siblings searching for brothers and sisters, from husbands trying to locate wives. One advertisement, placed in the Knoxville Whig in November 1865 and repeated several times over the following months, caught his attention. Searching for Elizabeth and Garrett, stolen from her home near Jonesboro, Tennessee, in April 1863 when she was 3 years old. Distinguished by a crescent-shaped birthmark on the left side of her neck. Any information regarding her whereabouts should be directed to Thomas and Margaret Garrett, Jonesboro, Tennessee. Substantial reward offered. Michael felt a surge of excitement. The birthmark description matched perfectly. The timing was right. If Elizabeth had been 3 when she was taken in 1863, she would have been about 8 when the war ended in 1865, and about 23 when the photograph was taken in 1868. The age matched what he could estimate from the photograph. But why would she have been identified as Mary Colson rather than Elizabeth Garrett? And what did stolen mean in this context? Had she been kidnapped? Had she been separated from her family during some chaotic wartime event and ended up with people who gave her a different name? Michael spent the next week researching the Garrett family of Jonesboro. Thomas Garrett had been a schoolteacher before the war, relatively prosperous and well-educated by frontier standards. He and his wife Margaret had 3 children, with Elizabeth and being the youngest. In April 1863, during a Confederate raid through the area, their home had been burned. In the chaos of the attack and the family's flight to safety, 3-year-old Elizabeth had vanished. The family had searched frantically but found no trace of her. Local legends suggested that she had been taken by a Confederate sympathizer who had lost her own child and saw the raid as an opportunity to acquire a replacement. But there was no definitive evidence, and the child was never found. Thomas and Margaret Garrett had continued searching for years, placing advertisements, following every lead, but without success. Thomas had died in 1870, his wife in 1873, both of them never knowing what had become of their youngest daughter. But Michael had found an inventory of Thomas Garrett's possessions made after his death for probate purposes. Among his papers were dozens of responses to his newspaper advertisements, reports from people who claimed to have seen a child matching Elizabeth's description. Most had proven to be false leads, cases of mistaken identity or opportunistic attempts to claim the reward money. But one report, dated August 1869, described a young woman working as a household servant in the Cumberland Gap area who had a distinctive crescent-shaped birthmark on her neck. The report had been filed too late. By the time it reached Thomas Garrett, the young woman had already left the area, and despite his efforts to track her down, he had been unable to locate her. The trail had gone cold, and Thomas had died the following year without ever finding his daughter. Michael sat at his desk, staring at the documents spread before him, feeling the weight of the tragedy. Elizabeth Garrett, stolen as a child, raised under a different name with no memory of her original family, had been working as a servant just a few counties away from her parents who were desperately searching for her. And they had missed each other by mere weeks, the report arriving just after she had moved on, the connection failing to be made. But where had she gone after leaving the Reynolds household? And was there any possibility that she had eventually learned her true identity? Michael was determined to find out. This was no longer just an interesting historical puzzle. It was a human story that demanded to be told in full, a story of loss and identity and the possibility, however remote, of eventual reunion or recognition. Michael knew he needed help to track Elizabeth's movements after she left Cumberland Gap. He reached out to genealogists, local historians, and archivists across Tennessee and surrounding states, explaining what he had discovered and asking for assistance in locating any records that might mention Mary Colson or Elizabeth Garrett between 1869 and the end of the century. The response was overwhelming. Genealogists loved a mystery, especially one with clear documentary evidence and a compelling human story. Within days, Michael was receiving emails and messages from researchers across the region, each offering suggestions, pointing out archives he should check, sharing their own findings from local records. One genealogist, Amanda Chun from Chattanooga, proved particularly helpful. She specialized in tracing the movements of working-class women in the post-war South, and she had access to church records, employment registers, and census data that Michael hadn't known existed. She reached out to him after seeing his query on a historical research forum, offering to collaborate on tracking Elizabeth's path. They worked together over video calls, sharing screens as they went through documents, comparing notes, building a timeline of Elizabeth's possible movements. Amanda had a theory that Elizabeth might have moved to one of the larger towns in the region, seeking better employment opportunities or possibly trying to learn more about her own origins. Young women in her situation often ended up in cities, Amanda explained during one of their calls. There were more opportunities for domestic work, better wages, and more importantly, more anonymity. In a small mountain community, everyone knew your business. In a place like Knoxville or Chattanooga, you could reinvent yourself to some degree, ask questions about your past without the whole town gossiping about it. Following this theory, they concentrated their search on urban records. In the 1870 census for Knoxville, Amanda found an entry for a Mary Colson domestic servant living in a boarding house for working women. The age was listed as 25, which would be approximately correct if Mary was actually Elizabeth Garrett. The birthplace was listed as unknown, which was unusual enough to be noteworthy. Most census takers, even if they didn't know someone's exact birthplace, would have put down the state or at least Tennessee or South. The designation of unknown suggested that Mary herself didn't know where she had been born. Michael and Amanda found additional records placing Mary Colson in Knoxville through most of the 1870s. She had worked for several prominent families in the city, and her employers consistently described her as hardworking, intelligent, and eager to improve herself through education. She had attended evening classes at a church school, learning not just basic literacy but more advanced subjects including mathematics, history, and composition. In 1876, a local newspaper, the Knoxville Daily Chronicle, published a short article about the church school's graduation ceremony. Among the graduates mentioned was Mary Colson, who had delivered a speech about the importance of education for working women. The article included a brief quote from her speech. "Many of us do not know where we came from, but through education, we can determine where we are going. Our pasts may be obscured, but our futures can be bright." Michael felt a lump in his throat reading those words. Elizabeth, or Mary as she still called herself, had clearly been aware of the gaps in her own history, had felt the absence of knowledge about her origins. But rather than being paralyzed by that absence, she had focused on building a future, on creating an identity through her own efforts and choices. The research became more difficult after 1880. Mary's name disappeared from Knoxville records, and for several months, Michael and Amanda couldn't find any trace of her. They expanded their search, looking at records from cities across the South and into the Midwest, following the migration patterns of the era as people moved in search of economic opportunities. It was Amanda who finally found the next clue. In a collection of letters held by the East Tennessee Historical Society, she discovered correspondence between two sisters who had both lived in Knoxville in the 1870s. One sister, Jane Morrison, had moved to Lexington, Kentucky, in 1879, and her letters back to her sister in Knoxville provided glimpses of daily life in her new city. In a letter dated May 1880, Jane mentioned hiring a new housekeeper, a woman named Mary who had come with excellent references from families in Knoxville. "She is most capable," Jane wrote, "and has a fascinating story, though she speaks little of it. She bears a mark upon her neck that she says has been with her since birth, and she has long wondered whether her people might recognize her by it." She placed an advertisement in the newspaper here, describing herself and the mark, in hopes that someone might respond with information about her family. Michael immediately began searching Lexington newspapers from 1880 for Mary's advertisement. It took 3 days of going through page by page, but he finally found it in the June 12, 1880 edition of the Lexington Daily Press. The advertisement was heartbreaking in its directness. "Young woman, approximately 20 years of age in 1863, seeks information about family of origin. Bears distinctive crescent-shaped birthmark on left neck. Earliest memories are of living in mountain cabin with family not her own. Answers to name Mary Colson but believes this may not be birth name. Any information gratefully received. Respond to Mary Colson, care of Morrison Household, Mill Street, Lexington, Kentucky." Michael sat back, overwhelmed by the poignancy of the message. Elizabeth had been actively searching for her own identity, trying to find her birth family, placing advertisements just as her father had done years earlier. But by 1880, both of her parents were dead, and her older siblings, if they had survived the war, might not have seen the advertisement or might not have connected it to their long-lost sister. He searched for responses to the advertisement, going through subsequent issues of the newspaper, looking for any letters or notices that might have been connected to Mary's search. He found several responses in the letters to the editor section over the following weeks. Most were sympathetic but unhelpful, people expressing support for her search but having no useful information. One letter, however, stood out. It was from a woman named Catherine Morris, dated July 1880. She wrote that she had been a neighbor of the Garrett family in Jonesboro before the war and remembered the tragic loss of their youngest daughter in 1863. She described Elizabeth's distinctive birthmark and suggested that Mary Colson might indeed be the missing Elizabeth Garrett. Catherine provided details about the family, about Thomas and Margaret Garrett, about Elizabeth's older siblings. Michael's hands shook as he read the letter. This was the moment when Elizabeth should have learned her true identity, should have been reunited with any surviving family members, should have reclaimed her birth name and her history. He immediately began searching for any indication of what had happened next, any evidence that Elizabeth and her surviving family members had made contact. What he found was more complicated than he had hoped. Records showed that Mary had indeed traveled to Jonesboro in August 1880. A hotel register from the town listed Mary Colson, Lexington, Kentucky, for a 3-day stay. Local newspaper archives contained a brief notice that a young woman was visiting the town, seeking information about the Garrett family and the child who had been lost during the war. But there was a problem. By 1880, Thomas and Margaret Garrett were both dead, and their surviving children had scattered. The oldest son, Robert, had moved to Texas after the war. The middle daughter, Catherine, had married and moved to Virginia. Neither of them had seen the Lexington newspaper advertisement, and neither had been in Jonesboro when Mary visited. A letter in the collection of the Jonesboro Historical Society, written by a local minister who had known the Garrett family, described meeting Mary during her visit. He had confirmed that the Garrett family had indeed lost a daughter matching her description, had shown her the family's plot in the town cemetery where Thomas and Margaret were buried, had given her what information he could about the family's history. But he had been unable to definitively confirm that she was Elizabeth Garrett, and he had no way to contact her surviving siblings. She wept at the graveside, the minister wrote in his letter, and said she felt certain these were her parents, that something in her heart recognized this as her home, despite having no conscious memories of it. But without living family to confirm her identity and welcome her back, she felt adrift between two identities, neither fully Mary Colson nor fully Elizabeth Garrett. It was a sorrowful parting, and I prayed for her peace and resolution. Michael found himself deeply moved by this account. Elizabeth had come so close to reclaiming her identity, to reconnecting with her family history, only to find that time had taken away the people who could have confirmed her story and welcomed her home. She had stood at her parents' grave, knowing or at least strongly suspecting that these were the people who had searched for her so desperately, but unable to fully cross the bridge from uncertainty to certainty. The question remained, what had happened to Elizabeth after this bittersweet visit to Jonesboro? Had she continued to call herself Mary Colson, accepting that her past would remain partially obscured? Or had she claimed the name Elizabeth Garrett, even without definitive proof, taking ownership of the identity she believed was hers? Amanda found the answer in an unexpected place. She had been searching through marriage records across Kentucky and Tennessee, looking for any mention of Mary Colson or Elizabeth Garrett. In the marriage register for Fayette County, Kentucky, dated October 1881, she found an entry for Elizabeth Garrett, also known as Mary Colson, marrying a man named Daniel Foster, a teacher at a school for working-class children in Lexington. The fact that both names were listed suggested that Elizabeth had begun the process of reclaiming her birth identity, even while acknowledging the name she had carried for most of her conscious life. It was a compromise of sorts, a way of honoring both the life she had lived and the identity she believed had been stolen from her. Michael and Amanda continued tracing Elizabeth's life after her marriage. She and Daniel Foster had remained in Lexington, where Daniel taught and Elizabeth became involved in charitable work, particularly focused on helping children who had been displaced or orphaned. They had 3 children together, all of whom survived to adulthood. Census records showed the family living modestly but comfortably, Daniel's teaching income supplemented by Elizabeth's work as a seamstress. In the 1900 census, Elizabeth, now 58 years old, was listed as Elizabeth Foster, née Garrett. Her birthplace was listed as Jonesboro, Tennessee, a definitive claim to her origins despite the years of uncertainty. The census taker had noted in the margin, "Subject bears distinctive birthmark used to identify her as child lost during war. Reunited with family history in 1880. This notation suggested that Elizabeth's story had become known in her community, that she had shared her history with neighbors and friends, that her unusual path from stolen child to rediscovered identity had become part of her public narrative. Michael wondered if she had felt relief at finally being able to claim her story openly, at being recognized as Elizabeth Garrett Foster rather than as Mary Colson of unknown origins. The most moving discovery came from a collection of letters held by the Kentucky Historical Society. In 1898, Elizabeth had written to the minister in Jonesboro who had helped her during her visit 18 years earlier. She thanked him for his kindness and updated him on her life. Most significantly, she described how she had finally made contact with her surviving siblings. Elizabeth's letter to the Jonesboro minister, written in careful, educated script that reflected the years she had spent improving herself through evening classes and self-study, provided details of how she had finally connected with her brother and sister. The story emerged through her words, a narrative of persistence and the gradual reconstruction of broken family bonds. Reverend Williams, the letter began, I trust this letter finds you in good health and spirits. I write to thank you once again for your kindness during my visit to Jonesboro in 1880, and to inform you of a development that has brought me great joy and some sorrow. I have at last made contact with my brother Robert and my sister Catherine, the siblings I lost so many years ago. She explained that the connection had come about through a circuitous route. In 1895, a former soldier who had served with Robert Garrett during the war had happened to visit Lexington on business. He had stayed at a boarding house run by a woman who knew Elizabeth and her story. The boarding house owner had mentioned Elizabeth's search for her family, describing her birthmark and her belief that she was the lost daughter of the Garrett family of Jonesboro. The former soldier had been startled by this information. He knew that Robert Garrett, with whom he had maintained correspondence over the years, had never stopped grieving the loss of his younger sister during the war. He immediately wrote to Robert, explaining what he had learned and providing Elizabeth's address in Lexington. Robert's response had come within weeks. He had traveled from Texas to Kentucky to meet the woman who might be his lost sister. Elizabeth described that meeting in her letter. When Robert arrived at our home, I knew him before he spoke. There was something in his face, in the shape of his eyes and the line of his jaw, that echoed what I saw when I looked in the mirror. And when he saw the mark upon my neck, the crescent moon that our mother had called my kissing star, he wept as I have never seen a man weep. Robert had brought with him a small collection of family items. A few photographs, including one of Elizabeth as a toddler that showed the distinctive birthmark clearly, letters that their mother had written expressing her grief over the lost child, a lock of hair that Margaret Garrett had kept from Elizabeth's first haircut. These tangible connections to her past had overwhelmed Elizabeth, providing physical proof of the identity she had claimed but never been able to fully verify. The reunion had been joyful but also painful. Robert told Elizabeth about their parents' deaths, about how their father had never given up searching for her, about how their mother had kept Elizabeth's few baby clothes until the day she died. He described the family Elizabeth had lost, the years of shared history she had missed, the grandparents and cousins and family friends who had known her as a child but whom she would never remember. But Robert had also brought news of their sister Catherine. She had married and settled in Virginia, had 4 children of her own, and had maintained contact with Robert despite the distance between them. Robert arranged for Catherine to visit Lexington the following summer, creating the first reunion of all 3 surviving Garrett siblings in over 30 years. Elizabeth's letter described that reunion with deep emotion. When Catherine arrived, we stood on the porch of my home, she and Robert and I, and it was as if time collapsed. We were children again, a family again, despite all the years and distance and loss. Catherine remembered me as a baby, remembered playing with me, remembered the morning we fled our burning home and I vanished in the chaos. She has carried guilt all these years, feeling that she should have held my hand more tightly, should have protected me better. I was able to tell her that no blame attaches to her, that we were all victims of circumstances beyond our control. Michael read and reread this letter, moved by Elizabeth's grace and emotional intelligence. She had every right to be angry about what had been stolen from her, to rage against the injustice of being taken from her family and raised under a false identity. But instead, she focused on healing, on building bridges to her rediscovered siblings, on creating whatever future connection was possible rather than dwelling on the past that had been lost. The letter also revealed something about Elizabeth's ongoing uncertainty about exactly what had happened to her in 1863. She wrote, "I have tried to remember that day, to recall any detail of how I came to be separated from my family and ended up in the mountains with the people who raised me as Mary. But my memories begin several years later, with no recollection of my early childhood. The family who raised me, whom I knew as parents until they died when I was 17, never spoke of how I came to them. I believe they knew I was not theirs by birth, but whether they took me deliberately or found me abandoned, I cannot say. They were not cruel people, but they were not warm either. Perhaps they carried guilt about my presence in their home." This uncertainty troubled Michael. The question of how Elizabeth had been separated from her family and ended up in the Cumberland Mountains remained unanswered. The original advertisement placed by her father had used the word "stolen," suggesting intentional kidnapping. But Elizabeth herself didn't know whether she had been deliberately taken or simply lost in the chaos of the raid and found by another family. Michael decided to dig deeper into the events of April 1863 in Washington County, Tennessee, where Jonesboro was located. He found records of Confederate cavalry movements through the area that month, part of a broader campaign to disrupt Union supply lines and intimidate Union sympathizers in East Tennessee. The raids had been violent and chaotic, with homes burned, property confiscated, and civilians caught in the crossfire. A newspaper account from May 1863 described the raid on the Garrett property. The home of Thomas Garrett, known as a Union sympathizer and teacher of abolitionist principles, was attacked by Confederate irregulars who fired the dwelling and scattered the family into the woods. Several nearby families sheltered the Garretts in the aftermath, but the youngest child, a girl of 3 years, could not be found. It is feared she perished in the chaos, though no remains were discovered. But Michael found another account, this one from a diary kept by a woman named Ruth Anderson who had lived near the Garretts. Her entry for April 22, 1863, noted, "Terrible doings at the Garrett place. House burned, family fled. Sarah Pritchard was seen leaving the area in a wagon with what looked like a small child, though she has no children of her own. She and her husband have been vocal in their Confederate sympathies and their contempt for Union families like the Garretts. I wonder if she took the Garrett child, seeing an opportunity to acquire what she could not produce herself. But who would believe such an accusation in these times?" Michael felt his pulse quicken. Sarah Pritchard. He searched for that name in connection with the Cumberland Mountains, looking for any evidence that the Pritchards had relocated to that area after the war. What he found confirmed his suspicion. Land records showed that James and Sarah Pritchard had purchased property near Cumberland Gap in late 1863, establishing a small farm there. A census record from 1865 listed them with one child, a daughter named Mary, age approximately 5 years. The pieces fell into place. Sarah Pritchard, unable to have children of her own, had taken advantage of the chaos of the raid to kidnap 3-year-old Elizabeth Garrett. She and her husband had immediately left the area, relocating to the Cumberland Mountains where no one would know them or question the sudden appearance of a young daughter. They had renamed the child Mary, perhaps hoping that she would forget her original identity, and had raised her as their own. When the Pritchards died, possibly from disease or injury, Elizabeth, still known as Mary, had been left alone at around 17 years old. She had found work with the Reynolds family as a household servant, which was when the 1868 photograph had been taken. And she had lived the next several years with no clear memory of her early childhood, knowing only that something felt incomplete about her identity, that her history had gaps she couldn't fill. Michael shared these findings with Amanda, who helped him piece together additional details from property and court records. They found that after the Pritchards' deaths, their small farm had been sold to pay debts, and the proceeds had gone to distant relatives who had no interest in taking responsibility for Mary. She had been left to make her own way, which explained why she had moved between different households, working as a domestic servant while trying to educate herself and search for information about her origins. "This is extraordinary," Amanda said during one of their video calls, her face serious on Michael's screen. "We've basically solved a Civil War-era kidnapping case. We know who took Elizabeth, why they took her, where they went, and how she eventually began the process of recovering her identity." This is the kind of resolution that families from that period almost never got. Michael agreed, but he also felt a deep sadness. Elizabeth had been stolen from a loving family, had lost the opportunity to grow up with parents who desperately wanted her, had spent years not knowing who she really was. Even after discovering her identity, she had never gotten to speak with her parents, never gotten to hear them say that they loved her, and had never stopped looking for her. That loss could never be fully repaired, no matter how joyful her eventual reunion with her siblings had been. But there was more to Elizabeth's story. Michael continued reading through her letters to Reverend Williams, finding that she had maintained a correspondence with him until his death in 1904. In these letters, Elizabeth shared details of her life, her growing family, her work with displaced and orphan children, and her ongoing reflection on her unusual life story. In an 1899 letter, she wrote about her decision to work with vulnerable children. "My own experience of displacement and lost identity has given me particular sympathy for children who find themselves without family or certain knowledge of their origins. I have made it my mission to help such children maintain connections to their past, to ensure that their stories are recorded and preserved, so that, unlike me, they do not spend decades without knowing who they truly are. If my suffering can serve to prevent others from experiencing similar pain, then perhaps it had purpose." This passage revealed Elizabeth's resilience and her choice to transform trauma into service. Rather than being consumed by bitterness about what had been taken from her, she had devoted herself to helping others avoid similar fates. Michael found records showing that Elizabeth had worked with several orphanages and children's aid societies in Lexington, had advocated for better record-keeping to prevent children from losing their identities, and had personally assisted several displaced children in reconnecting with their families. Michael also found evidence that Elizabeth had maintained close relationships with her rediscovered siblings for the rest of their lives. Robert moved back to Tennessee in 1900, settling near Knoxville to be closer to Elizabeth. Catherine visited regularly from Virginia, and the three siblings spent holidays together, creating new family traditions and sharing stories that helped Elizabeth fill in the gaps in her history. In the 1910 census, the last one in which Elizabeth appeared, she was listed as Elizabeth Garrett Foster, age 50, birthplace Tennessee, parents Thomas and Margaret Garrett deceased. She had fully reclaimed her birth identity, and her children were recorded with full knowledge of their maternal grandparents and family history. The legacy that had been broken by Sarah Pritchard's selfish act had been partially restored through Elizabeth's determination and the reconnection with her siblings. Elizabeth Foster died in 1915 at the age of 55. Her obituary in the Lexington Herald described her as a woman of remarkable character who overcame extraordinary early circumstances to build a life of service and devotion to family. The obituary mentioned her work with displaced children and noted that she was survived by her husband, 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and her sister Catherine Garrett Henderson of Virginia. Robert Garrett had died the previous year. Michael found Elizabeth's grave in the Lexington Cemetery, a modest headstone that read, "Elizabeth Garrett Foster, 1860 to 1915, beloved wife, mother, and friend. Lost and found." The phrase "lost and found" struck him as particularly poignant, a summation of an entire life's journey in 3 simple words. After months of intensive research, Michael prepared to publish his findings. But before doing so, he wanted to determine if there were any living descendants of Elizabeth who should be informed about what he had discovered. Working with Amanda and several genealogists, he traced Elizabeth's line forward through the 20th century. Elizabeth's 3 children had all married and had families of their own. Her daughter, Margaret, named after the grandmother she never met, had been particularly interested in family history and had preserved many of Elizabeth's letters and papers. Margaret's descendants had continued this tradition of record-keeping, maintaining a family archive that documented not just births and deaths but stories and relationships. Through genealogical databases and public records, Michael identified living descendants in Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee. The most direct line came through Elizabeth's youngest son, James Foster, whose great-great-granddaughter, Claire Foster Williams, lived in Louisville. Michael reached out to her via email, carefully explaining his research and asking if she would be interested in learning more about her ancestor's story. Claire's response came within hours, and her excitement was palpable even through the formal medium of email. "I have heard family stories about a great-great-grandmother who had been kidnapped during the Civil War and later reunited with her birth family," Claire wrote. "But I never knew the details, and I certainly didn't know there was a photograph that started it all. I would love to meet with you and learn more." They arranged to meet at the Davidson County Historical Archive, where Michael could show Claire the original photograph and the extensive documentation he had compiled. Claire brought her teenage daughter, Morgan, explaining that she wanted the next generation to understand this important family history. When Claire saw the photograph for the first time, she was silent for a long moment, studying the young woman standing at the edge of the porch, the crescent-shaped birthmark just visible on her neck. "That's her," Claire finally said, her voice soft. "That's Elizabeth. I've seen later photographs of her as an older woman, but never anything from this early in her life, when she still thought she was Mary Colson." Michael showed them the research he had compiled, explaining each step of the investigation, from his initial curiosity about the birthmark to the discovery of Elizabeth's kidnapping, her search for her identity, and her eventual reunion with her siblings. Claire listened intently, occasionally asking questions, her daughter taking notes on her phone. "This changes how I understand my own family," Claire said when Michael had finished his presentation. "I knew we came from people who had faced hardship and overcome it, but I didn't understand the depth of what Elizabeth had experienced. To lose your entire identity as a child, to be raised by the people who stole you, to spend years searching for who you really were, and then to find the strength to reconnect with your birth family and build a meaningful life, that's extraordinary." Morgan, who had been quiet throughout most of the meeting, spoke up. Did she ever express anger about what happened to her? In her letters, did she talk about how she felt about Sarah Pritchard taking her? Michael pulled up a letter Elizabeth had written to her brother Robert in 1896. "She did address it," he said, "though perhaps not in the way you might expect." He read aloud, "Robert, you have asked me how I feel toward the woman who took me from our parents. I will tell you honestly that I struggle with this question. She stole years from me, years I could have spent with mother and father, years when I could have known you and Catherine as siblings rather than as strangers I would meet in middle age. That loss is profound and I grieve for it. But I also recognize that she must have been driven by her own pain, her own desperate desire for a child. What she did was wrong, but I choose not to let hatred for her poison the years I have remaining. I choose instead to honor our parents' memory by living fully, by loving my own children fiercely, and by ensuring that other children do not suffer similar displacement if I can prevent it." Claire wiped tears from her eyes. She chose forgiveness and purpose over bitterness. "That's remarkable." Michael spent the next hour sharing additional details from his research, showing Claire documents and photographs he had collected, explaining the historical context of the Civil War era and Reconstruction period. He also explained his plans to publish his findings in an academic journal and potentially develop an exhibition that would use Elizabeth's story to explore themes of identity, displacement, and family reconnection during the Civil War era. Claire enthusiastically supported both ideas. She also offered to provide access to the family papers that had been preserved through the generations, documents that would add additional depth and personal detail to the story. "Elizabeth saved almost everything," Claire explained. "Letters from her siblings, documents related to her charitable work, even newspaper clippings about the search for missing children during the war. My grandmother inherited it all and was meticulous about preservation. I think Elizabeth wanted her story documented, wanted future generations to understand what she had experienced." Over the following months, Michael worked with Claire and other family descendants to compile a comprehensive account of Elizabeth's life. The result was far richer than his initial research, incorporating personal letters, photographs, and family stories that brought Elizabeth to life as a full, complex person rather than just an interesting historical case study. The academic article Michael published in the Journal of Southern History attracted significant attention. Historians appreciated the meticulous research and the way the case study illuminated broader patterns of displacement and identity during the Civil War period. But it was the human story that captured people's imagination, the narrative of a stolen child who grew into a woman determined to reclaim her identity and transform her suffering into service. A museum curator from the Tennessee State Museum contacted Michael about developing an exhibition based on Elizabeth's story. The exhibition, titled Lost and Found: Identity and Family in Civil War America, opened 18 months after Michael's initial discovery of the photograph. It featured the original 1868 image prominently, along with other photographs of Elizabeth at different stages of her life, documents relating to her kidnapping and search for identity, and contextual materials about the broader social history of the period. But the exhibition's most powerful element was a video interview with Claire and other descendants, in which they reflected on what Elizabeth's story meant to their family and to contemporary audiences. Claire spoke eloquently about resilience, about the importance of preserving family stories, and about how understanding the past could inform present-day concerns about displaced children and family separation. "My great-great-grandmother's experience resonates today," Claire said in the interview. "We still have children being separated from families, still have people searching for their origins and identities, still have families torn apart by war and violence." Elizabeth's story reminds us that these are not just statistics or abstract policy issues. They are human beings with names and faces and birthmarks shaped like crescent moons. They are people whose stories deserve to be told and remembered. The exhibition traveled to several museums across the South, attracting crowds everywhere it appeared. Michael gave numerous talks about the research, and he was struck by how many people came up to him afterward to share their own family stories of displacement, separation, and eventual reunion. Elizabeth's story had touched something universal, a reminder that many families carried histories of loss and recovery, that identity was often more complicated and fragile than it appeared on the surface. Michael also heard from historians and genealogists who had been inspired by his methodology. Several wrote to say they were taking fresh looks at old photographs in their collections, examining them more carefully for details that might reveal hidden stories. The birthmark on Elizabeth's neck had been visible in the photograph all along, but it had taken someone paying close attention, someone willing to ask questions and follow leads, to uncover its significance. 2 years after the initial discovery, Michael was invited to give a keynote address at a national conference on Civil War history. He spoke about Elizabeth's story, but he also reflected more broadly on the importance of attending to small details in historical research, to the way that individual lives could illuminate larger historical patterns, and to the ethical responsibilities historians had to tell complete stories that honored the complexity of human experience. "When I first noticed the mark on Mary's neck in that 1868 photograph," Michael told the audience, "I had no idea where the investigation would lead. I was simply curious about what seemed like an anomaly, a detail that didn't quite fit the standard narrative. But that curiosity led me to discover an entire life story, a narrative of kidnapping and loss, of searching and eventual reunion, of resilience and purpose." He paused, looking out at the audience of historians and students. "I think this is what we are called to do as historians. Not just to document the broad sweep of events, the movements of armies and the decisions of leaders, but to attend to individual lives, to notice the details that reveal human stories, to remember that every name in a census record, every face in an old photograph, represents a full and complex life that deserves to be understood and honored." The applause was sustained and heartfelt. Afterward, dozens of people approached Michael to thank him for his work, to share their own research projects, to express appreciation for the way he had told Elizabeth's story with both scholarly rigor and deep humanity. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from a young woman who introduced herself as a social worker focused on helping foster children maintain connections to their biological families. "I work with children who have been separated from their birth families for various reasons," she explained. "Many of them struggle with questions of identity, with not knowing their full stories. I'm going to use Elizabeth's story in my work to help these children understand that searching for your identity is valid and important, that it's possible to build a meaningful life even when your origins are uncertain, and that the search itself, even if it doesn't provide all the answers you hope for, can be part of healing." Michael felt deeply moved by this. Elizabeth's story, which had begun with a mark on her neck in a photograph taken more than a century and a half ago, was continuing to resonate, continuing to provide comfort and guidance to people facing similar challenges in the present day. This was the power of historical research done with care and empathy, the way that understanding the past could illuminate the present and perhaps even shape the future. On a crisp October morning 5 years after his initial discovery, Michael returned to the Davidson County Historical Archive. The photograph that had started everything was on permanent display now, part of the archive's core collection. He stood before it, as he had so many times, looking at the young woman standing at the edge of the porch, the mark on her neck that had told him there was a story waiting to be uncovered. He thought about Elizabeth's life, about all that she had endured and overcome, about the family she had lost and eventually found again, about the children she had helped and the legacy she had left. He thought about Claire and Morgan and all of Elizabeth's other descendants, carrying forward her story and her values into the present day. And he thought about all the other photographs in archives around the world, all the other faces looking out from the past, each with stories that deserve to be told. "Thank you," Michael said softly to the photograph, to Elizabeth, to the past that had revealed itself through careful attention and persistent research. "Thank you for your story." The photograph remained unchanged, of course, the same faded sepia tones, the same figures arranged on the porch, the same young woman with the distinctive mark on her neck. But it was no longer a mystery. It was a testament, a witness, a bridge between past and present. It was Elizabeth Garrett Foster, lost and found, remembered and honored. And in the remembering, her story lived on.